Hi, I'd like to welcome everyone. This is our second lecture to celebrate Preservation Week 2010. And this is co-sponsored by the City of Cleveland Heights, our Landmark Commission, Future Heights, and the Cleveland Heights Historical Society. Welcome to everyone who, I see a lot of familiar faces, but I also see some new faces. So we appreciate everyone coming. In case you haven't been here before, the restrooms are through the door there. And afterwards, we will, what we'd like to do is leave the questions till the end, and we'll answer the questions. If you have a question at the end, we'd like you to speak it into a microphone, because we do tape these to play on the city's cable channel. So if you enjoyed it, you can look for it and tell your friends to watch it in a few weeks when we put it up on the cable channel. With that, my name is Kara Hamley O'Donnell, and I'm the city planner at the City of Cleveland Heights Planning Department. And I am the person who's in charge of the schoolhouse. And I'm going to pass this over to Lita Gonzalez, who is with the organization of Future Heights, which is co-sponsoring this. And then our speaker is involved with the Landmark Commission and with the Cleveland Heights Historical Society. So I'll pass it off to Lita.
Hi, my name's Lita Gonzalez, and I'm on the board of directors of Future Heights. And I want to say good evening to you. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. Our organization does many things in this community for the residents. We engage residents in civic life and build community in the Heights. We're an organization that encourages our residents to shop local and to support the many independently owned businesses that serve our community. We are currently working with several business owners to form the Heights Independent Business Alliance, which would enable local businesses to market themselves more effectively and to bring more people to the Heights and into their shops. We initiate discussions on important community issues. For instance, last month, we convened a number of stakeholders on the topic of sustainability. And we're working with that group to create a map of the green initiatives that are here in the community, in the Heights, and bring the discussion to a larger community. And you may know that we're the publisher of the Heights Observer. And if you haven't taken your copy, please do so. There's some there. And as you know, this is a community newspaper. And it's written by the residents for the Heights. And this project is open to all. And if you haven't had a chance to write for the Observer, I encourage you to do it. It really is a wonderful experience. It can be a little intimidating at first, but I will tell you, the editors are wonderful, and they will work with you to make sure that your story is exactly what you want it. And Deanna Bremer is just incredible to work with, and she will work with you to make sure your topic is set. So I encourage you to do that. If you've got an interest, think about writing a story. You can learn more about Future Heights at our annual meeting, which is coming up on June 30th. Our speaker will be Kirk Noden from the Mahoning Valley Organizing Collaborative, and he's going to tell us about new community building techniques. His talk is entitled Beyond Block Parties, Building the Safe, Livable Communities in the 21st Century. So find out more in the June issue of the Heights Observer, which will be coming out soon. And now let me say that Future Heights is very proud to co-sponsor tonight's event. Cleveland Heights has many unique and historic neighborhoods, and Future Heights encourages and supports efforts to tell their stories. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker for tonight, Christopher Roy. Chris is president of the Cleveland Heights Historical Society and a member of the Landmark Commission of Cleveland Heights. By day, he is a mild-mannered business marketing and technology consultant. And during his tenure with the Historical Society, Chris has launched an extensive website devoted to Cleveland Heights history, written and edited some 24 historical newsletters, and contributed to and given numerous lectures on local history. So please help me welcome Chris Roy.
Carrie, want to shoot the lights down? I see a lot of familiar and friendly faces here. Is this working? I can never tell. It's working. Anyway, I see a lot of nice, familiar, and friendly faces here, including Steve Tichenal, who has probably seen, scanned, or somehow altered every photograph that we're going to see here tonight. So I'm especially grateful to the people who came out tonight, who may have seen parts or images that we're going to show here. As Lita Gonzalez kindly mentioned, I'm Chris Roy, and I am dictator for life of the Cleveland Heights Historical Society. And I'm very grateful for everybody who came out tonight, given the fact that the weather's gorgeous, and a lot of us would probably, feel more fulfilled if we were outside enjoying it. So with that, I'm very grateful that everybody did show up, and hopefully we'll give you some interesting things to look at. Kara, maybe a tad lower on the lights, would you mind? Oh, never mind. Okay. Anyway, as many of you know, Cleveland Heights was one of the area's first garden suburbs that was settled, more or less en masse beginning in the late 1890s. And the area obviously was inhabited long before that. We tend to speak in terms of white people's history. But although Cleveland Heights is not, it's never been documented that Cleveland Heights actually was home to any specific Indian tribe. We know that the area surrounding the Heights area or along Lake Erie was populated by tribes such as the Erie and the Seneca. In the late 18th and early 19th century, pioneers established settlements in the area along Mayfield and Superior roads. This was long before Cleveland Heights existed. We have people such as Cyrus and Darius Ford, who raised silkworms and aided runaway slaves in the neighborhood of Mayfield and Superior. A gentleman by the name of Peter Rush forged through Noble and Yellowstone roads. The Shakers ran a broom factory near Lee Road, along with some 24 other buildings, primarily along Lee Road between North and South Park. There was a grist mill at Coventry Road and Fairmont Boulevard, and stone quarries at North Park and Grandview. And immediately at the top of what we now know as Cedar Hill, there was a large farm that was settled by a gentleman by the name of Streeter. And that is the area that our city's unofficial founder, Patrick Calhoun, with funds provided by none other than John D. Rockefeller, chose as the site for his Euclid Heights project, which consisted primarily of Overlook, Edge Hill, Norfolk, Berkshire, and Kenilworth roads. Ironically, that is one of the few spots left in what we might refer to as Western Cleveland Heights that has not been placed on the National Register of Historic Places, an error that we hope will be redeemed when somebody has a few thousand hours to put it against it. So in any event, I'd like to present a brief tour of the many Cleveland Heights districts that are on the National Register. I cannot help but believe that our city boasts more of these districts than most, if not all, regions in Ohio. So my talk will deal mainly with historic photographs and tidbits rather than architecture. And I'd also like to apologize in advance for any inaccurate statements, and I would encourage anybody to wave their hand frantically and correct me at any time. So I'd like to start by basically discussing the National Register itself. As you can see, worthy of preservation, I skip a picture, means significance at the local, state, or national level. Significance can pertain to American history, to architecture, to archaeology, to engineering, or to culture. The program is national, but it is administered at the state level, meaning that when application for National Register status is filed, it's filed with the state of Ohio, not with the federal government. Basically, our state recognizes 5 categories of consideration: buildings, structures, sites, objects, and districts. In other words, a district would have to be judged to have significance in one or more likely several of these areas. Some people are concerned that National Register designation encumbers or restricts their right to manage their homes or property in the way that they choose. And that is not true. Although districts and houses are obviously different with respect to how people can influence them, the reality is that people whose homes have been designated can do more or less whatever they want to them. However, federal tax incentives may allow for up to a 20% investment tax credit for certified rehabilitation of historically designated homes or homes that are in recognized historic districts. Here you see a quick overview of the process involved in applying and being accepted for National Register status. In the case of a historic district involving more than 50 property owners, public hearings and notices are important to generate consensus, and we'll be talking solely about historic districts here today, although there are a few structures, individual structures in Cleveland Heights that have also received designation as national landmarks, including the building that we're in presently, as well as famous structures such as the Gallagher Tremaine house on Fairmont Boulevard and the Rockefeller Building at Lee Road and Mayfield. What seems to be most important in the case of creating a National Register historic district is basically the zeal and dedication of one or more of a small group of people who literally make it happen. And I don't know all the names, but some good examples are Janet Cocolat, who drove the process for Ambler Heights, the first couple of Euclid Golf, Deanna Bremer and Hugh Fisher, the dynamic Dianas, Diana Wellman and Diana Woodbridge, who pulled the Inglewood nomination together, and the Heights neighborhood's newest Hall of Famer, Mark Souther, who spearheaded the process for Grant Deming's Forest Hill. That Forest Hill having nothing to do whatsoever with Forest Hill Park, Forest Hill neighborhood, or Forest Hill anything that most of us are familiar with. So in any event, here are the districts. Since the Fair Hill Road Village and Shaker Heights and the Shaker Lakes are predominantly in other cities, and because I don't have many historically contextual photographs, we won't be covering these on the photo tour. Once again, my apologies to Steve Tichnell, who has seen these pictures ad nauseum. You're welcome to read during the presentation if you so desire. Our first historic development is Fairmont Boulevard, which is one of two overlapping real estate developments. East of Coventry, Orison, Mantis, Van Swearingen, the Vans, developed homes east of Coventry between 1905 and 1915. These homes were known as Shaker Village, which is why some people ask us if this area used to be in Shaker Heights. The area was incorporated into Cleveland Heights in 1922, and Shaker Village was actually the Vans' second real estate venture, their first being along Lake Avenue in Lakewood. And we'll actually explore a later one in Cleveland Heights in a few minutes. Barton Deming developed homes west of Coventry between 1915 and 1925. The Deming development was marketed under the name of Euclid Golf because the Euclid Golf Club occupied most of the land at the very beginning of the century. The Euclid Golf National Register area actually overlaps the Fairmont Boulevard area, and this particular National Register entry involves only homes on Fairmount, extending from Deming's house east to just before Lee. In the pictures here, most of you will recognize after and before shots of Barton Deming's home at Cedar and Fairmount. The right photo was taken during the home's construction in 1914. This photo was taken in 1913, roughly where Fairmount meets Ardley. Look familiar? If you look closely in the center area, the old Roxboro School building can be seen in the background. It's very faint in this image, I apologize. And the open area to the left is part of the golf links, what was probably the 11th or 12th hole of the Euclid Golf Club. Here's a shot of the school, which stood for only about 15 years, from roughly 1905 to 1920, before it was torn down and replaced by the present Roxboro Elementary School. To the best of my knowledge, the need for a replacement school happened quite by accident, literally. Authorities needed to move the school, and the effort destabilized the structure to such an extent that it had to be torn down and replaced. If there are any Roxboro School alumni here, there's a good-sized history of the school that can be accessed through the stories section on the Cleveland Heights Historical Society's website. Here's another shot, even earlier, around 1902. Here you're basically looking west down Fairmount, right at the corner of Coventry. Imagine St. Paul's Church just to the right of the picture. How anyone knew that this is Fairmount and Lee is beyond me. I guess the photograph was just labeled fairly early on. I think we're looking south down Lee, which means that the borders of the Shaker community would be straight ahead. The largest concentration of Shaker settlement buildings was between what are now North Park and South Park, right along Lee. As a matter of fact, I think you can see a structure of some sort roughly in the left center, which, although it's only a guess, could well have been a Shaker building. A lot of them did survive well into the 20th century.
When was that painter estate wall built there at Fairmont?
The wall is original to the house, and I think the house was built in about the 1890s. Anybody know? 1904. Or 1904. Mary, right? Nice to have you. Of course, we can't exit the Fairmount district without looking at its arguably most famous house, the Gallagher Tremaine estate at 3001 Fairmount. This photo isn't necessarily the best of the bunch, but it illustrates that even in 1915, the home had its cachet. The background for a sales brochure image featuring the new Peerless automobile. Thanks to the Herculean efforts of Hugh Fisher and Deanna Bremer, Deanna, as Lita mentioned, is the executive director of Future Heights, we have a tremendously rich knowledge base of the Euclid Golf development, and many of the photos here were acquired by Hugh and Deanna. On the strength of their efforts, Euclid Golf was added to the National Register about 8 years ago. Euclid Golf also has its own website, which is accessible through the Historical Society's website, or you can simply Google Euclid Golf, and it will be the first thing that pops up. There's also a book on the area that was authored by Hugh and Deanna that is available on Amazon.com and perhaps still at local bookstores. In the meantime, enjoy the before and after shots here. The left photo is a grand house on Lower Fairmount. The right photo is a rear view of Deming's temporary office on Coventry Road, taken in May of 1913. The building sits at approximately where St. Paul's sign is today. To the right of the building, you can see details of some of the houses on Coventry between Coleridge and Scarborough. At the far end of the picture, you can see Coleridge Road itself, as well as a house that may be 2806 Coleridge. Not really visible on this image. Now let's look at the actual Euclid Golf Club. It was developed by Patrick Calhoun, who, as I mentioned, was also the founder of Euclid Heights. And the club existed only from about 1900 till 1912, when the land simply became too valuable to remain undeveloped. Architects Mead and Garfield, the latter the son of the president, designed the English-style clubhouse you see here. The course itself was laid out by William Herbert Bertie Way, golf pro at the Detroit Country Club, who had just placed second in the 1899 U.S. Open. The Euclid Golf Club actually was Cleveland's first professionally designed 18-hole golf course. Patrick Calhoun soon discovered that he did not have enough land for a proper 18-hole course, so he worked out an agreement with the neighboring property owner, John D. Rockefeller Sr. Rockefeller owned 141 acres just across Cedar Road south of the Euclid Heights development, and he agreed to lease his property rent-free with the stipulation that golf not be played on the Sabbath. So on Sundays, therefore, members would have to play the lower 9 holes twice. I will explain that in just one moment. Roughly 300 yards from where you live. Whoops, did I skip a page? Yes, I did. Here's another less colorful shot, probably facing southeast, that is coming up a drive from Euclid Heights Boulevard and what is now Surrey, which is where the very long, winding pathway and front entrance to the club was. Because of Hugh and Deanna's research efforts, we can identify almost exactly where this photo was taken. As you'll see in the next frame, this is roughly the green of the 9th hole, the corner of what is now Norfolk and Cedar. The clubhouse stood at what is, whoops, I just said that. The clubhouse stood precisely on the site where my parents lived at roughly the corner of Norfolk and Derbyshire, in answer to your question. This is one of my favorite efforts by Hugh and Deanna. In their research efforts for Euclid Golf, Hugh and Deanna also included overlapping the old golf course with the current Euclid Golf streets. You'll note that Bellevue and Grandview roads have no holes, that being the areas right in here. And the reason, of course, is that those streets had already been built, and thus golfers had to play around them, so to speak. But the clubhouse, as you can see, was roughly there, and this is basically east is on the left. So the length of Derbyshire Road was, for the most part, Euclid Golf, but the great majority of it was across Cedar. The Alcazar Hotel stands near what was the entrance to the club. Here's a photo taken, I'm guessing, in the late 1920s. The Alcazar was built in 1923. Several years ago, Harcourt resident Janet Coquelette succeeded in getting Ambler Heights, often referred to as the Harcourt Chestnut Hills area, onto the National Register. Thanks to her efforts, we also have a great deal of accumulated historical and architectural knowledge of this unique neighborhood. Ambler Heights was the brainchild of Dr. Nathan Hardy Ambler. Ambler made his fortune during the California gold rush largely by accepting gold dust in exchange for the dental work he performed on miners. He also dealt in real estate, buying property on the outskirts of Cleveland and reselling it as the city grew. The Ambler home stood on what is now the site of Baldwin Filtration Plant. Shortly after the Civil War, Ambler and his adopted son Daniel Caswell developed the Blue Rock Spring House, a water cure resort sanitarium which operated until 1908. If anybody knows precisely where that sanitarium was, I would love to know. Okay. That would make sense by what is Ambleside Road, as in Ambler. Thank you. Ambler died in November of 1888 and is buried in Lakeview Cemetery. However, Caswell and Ambler's widow, Martha, picked up the ball and laid out the Ambler Heights neighborhood between roughly 1900 and 1925. The photo on the right is surveyors cutting through what is now North Park Boulevard, but it was then called Ambler Parkway. And on the left is a fantastic Mediterranean stucco villa on Devonshire in the middle of the Ambler neighborhood that was designed by Howell and Thomas, the same firm that designed the Deming Mansion at the corner of Fairmount and Cedar. This particular house was literally built around an organ whose 747 pipes remain in the basement. Reverberates throughout the entire house. It's really quite amazing. Here's a different historical perspective on Ambler Heights. Taken roughly in the late 1930s, this shot looks down on the entrance to Ambler Heights. At the top of the picture on the right is Cedar Hill, where it meets Euclid Heights, and Harcourt is just to the left of that, roughly here. Our guess is that the photo was actually taken from a high window in the Edge Hill apartment building on the point of Cedar and Euclid Heights. About 10 years later, that apartment building was converted into a medical facility that we remember as Doctors Hospital. But back to Ambler Heights. But not right away. By the late 1950s, Doctors Hospital had become an accredited, modern, 200-bed hospital. In the late 1960s, the hospital closed, and the staff and service formed what is now Meridia Hillcrest Hospital in Mayfield Heights, near Som Center. Mayfield Heights got a hospital. We got a parking lot. One of the most photographed areas of the Heights 100 years ago was the road up Ambler Parkway, which is incorrectly referred to on this postcard as Euclid Heights Boulevard. There's no cliff of that resemblance anywhere along Euclid Heights Boulevard. The terrain is unmistakable because of the steep rise on the side and the ravine drop-off on the other side. This is the so-called Indian Fort that stood near the top of Ambler Parkway, which is now Stokes Boulevard, near the intersection of what is now Martin Luther King Drive. It stood on the edge of the Nathan Ambler property and in all likelihood was built by Ambler as an observation tower. And how it came to be associated with Indians and Indian fighters, I don't really know, but it's quite a persistent rumor. Incidentally, I like this card because it was addressed to Roy Christ. Taking another perspective on Ambler Heights, here's a shot looking up at the Ambler estate and mansion, which is not in what we typically think of as Ambler Heights. If you drive by the corner of Baldwin Road, which is now fenced off, coming up Stokes Boulevard, you can still see the massive stone staircase that once formed the main entrance pathway to the estate. You see behind the kids that stone stairway that is still there and can be visible primarily during the winter months because it's covered up by foliage during the summer. But if you drive up Stokes Boulevard right at the corner of Baldwin, when the leaves are off the trees, you can still see that staircase. Also, there is speculation that the wall that runs up the hill on the north side of the street was made from stones that were taken from the observation tower that we just saw. Our next famous area actually involves three National Register entities: the Forest Hill Park, the residential Forest Hill neighborhood, and the Rockefeller Building. As many of us know, John D. Rockefeller purchased the entire shoot and match throughout the 1870s and 80s, eventually amassing about 800 acres, roughly the size of Central Park. The estate extended all the way from Mayfield down to Euclid and from Superior east nearly to Taylor. Terrace Road and Forest Hills Boulevard weren't cut through until later. John D. Rockefeller Sr. moved to New York City in the 1880s, but he continued to visit every summer until about 1915, when his wife died. He sold the entire estate to his son for $2.8 million in 1923. Quite a deal. As many of you know, John D. Rockefeller Jr. undertook a major housing development in the late 1920s, which we'll talk about in a moment. John D. Rockefeller Jr. was an interesting, highly intelligent, and dedicated, but somewhat tormented guy who basically dedicated his life to redeeming the Rockefeller name. John D. Rockefeller Sr., the preeminent robber baron, was often referred to as the most hated man in the world. As part of his philanthropic efforts, John D. Rockefeller Jr. gave away or sold portions of Forest Hills to create Huron Road Hospital, Kirk Junior High School, and a Masonic Hall. Here's a classic shot of the Rockefeller Home. It was originally built as a water cure resort, similar to Nathan Ambler's Rock Rest, which was established at around the same time in the Fair Hill area. This resort was not successful, so John D. Rockefeller turned it into a summer home called the Homestead. How quaint. It reminds you of the homes in on Long Island or in Newport that they would refer to as cottages. The house was perched at the crest of what is now the sledding hill in Forest Hill Park, with a magnificent view that at the time extended all the way to the lake. Although I have not seen this, other people report that remnants of the foundation can still be found in the area. Some remnants of the stables to the southwest are visible, and the pond, of course, is still part of the park's wonderful vista. The gatehouse shown here in another of the postcards stood roughly at the intersection of what is now Superior and Euclid Avenue. So once again, you have a situation where there was a gatehouse that fronted right along a main street and then a pathway that must have been a good quarter-mile long before you ever even came in sight of the house. Life's tough. This is a windmill that stood on the property, perhaps to provide some power to certain out facilities on the estate. Although it's not clear from this angle, the windmill stood just off the shore of the lagoon, which, as we all know, is still very present. Outside the property, in the early 20th century, development was happening all around. As we know, a huge amount of Cleveland Heights sprang up in the 1920s. Looking north from a sidewalk on Superior, this is a high-activity shot of the corner at Mayfield, with the southwestern tip of Forest Hill visible in the upper right corner. A small group of outbuildings that you see towards the right side of the picture were actually part of the Rockefeller estate. This would be more or less across the street from Motorcars Honda. The north side of Mayfield in this area was one of the earliest and busiest commercial districts in Cleveland Heights, long before Saley Road or Cedar Fairmount. As we mentioned, John D. Rockefeller Jr. began an aggressive middle-class housing initiative in the 1920s, planning to build about 600 middle-class homes. The lead architect was Andrew Thomas, no relation to James William Thomas of Howell and Thomas fame. Only about 20% of these neighborhood homes were finished, 81 to be exact, primarily because of the onset of the Depression and because the houses were, by comparison to other districts, very expensive, $30,000, $40,000. Thus, most of the land remained fallow for several decades before a neighborhood of mostly ranch homes began to spring up in the 1950s. If you look closely at this picture, you'll see one of the most unusual features of some of the Rockefeller homes. Their infrastructure is made of steel rather than wood, and my sense is that it would take an atom bomb to knock some of these things off. Imagine what a serious gully this was before Forest Hills Boulevard and Bridge were built around 1936. The ravine that comprises what we now know as Forest Hills Boulevard, I believe, would have been one of the Dugway Brook tributaries. Am I right, anyone? We'll assume I am. Yeah, I should, shouldn't I? Lastly, we'll take a quick look at the gateway to the development, which is the Rockefeller Building, which was obviously meant to reflect the French Norman architecture and character of the entire development. This photo was taken around 1930. Even then, we were besieged by overhead power lines. Next, we come to Herrick Mews, also known as the Overlook Road carriage houses. This set of unique stables, built for the houses of 5 well-to-do citizens, is unique in all of Cleveland, clustered together around a private alley. Incidentally, the formal definition of mews is, quote, a group of buildings originally containing private stables, often converted into residential apartments. It also means a secret place or hideaway. The houses of the owners were located on Overlook Road north of the alley and were built between 1893 and 1898. Here's the home of the person after whom Herrick Mews is named, Myron Herrick, whom I guess we might refer to as the Muse of the Muse. Was a lawyer, businessman, politician, and ambassador to France who helped establish the Euclid National Bank, the Society for Savings, and the Euclid Arcade. Herrick also helped Marcus Hanna groom William McKinley for the presidency. Herrick himself later became governor of Ohio in 1903, soundly defeating Tom Johnson. He also served as ambassador to France shortly before the First World War. He remained in Paris after the outbreak of World War I, evacuating stranded Americans out of Europe and providing relief to war veterans. His house was on the point where Overlook Road curves, roughly where McGregor Home's Overlook House now stands. In the smaller picture, we see Herrick on the right in the company of Charles Lindbergh and French aviation pioneer Louis Blériot. Herrick was instrumental in organizing Charles Lindbergh's reception in Paris following the transatlantic flight in 1927. Incidentally, it's believed that Lindbergh proposed to his wife Annie Morrow Lindbergh in Anne's aunt's house, say that fast, on South Overlook. Taken in the 1970s, this was Myron Herrick's carriage house, now the beautiful home of Dennis Berry and Kathleen Coakley. It was by far the most visible of the 5 carriage houses, most of which are tucked into the trees. Judging by that hideous car on the right side, we can assume this photo was taken in the mid-1970s. Another owner of one of the carriage houses was a gentleman by the name of Howell Hines, then president of the United Mines Corporation and resident of this over-the-top Gothic home. It stood on the west side of Overlook Road, on the present site of the Church of the Christ Scientist. Incidentally, a book on Overlook Road is in the process of being printed, authored by Marion Morton, the Grand Dame of Cleveland Heights history, and should be available in bookstores and Amazon.com within a matter of weeks. Although not one of the homes with the Herrick Muse carriage house, this house has particular significance because it basically shielded the carriage houses from the view of people ascending Cedar Hill, much as the apartment complex that took its place does today. This is the Eels Mansion, and the wall that wraps all the way around the apartment complex is actually part of the original estate, and as we may be able to recall, the wall is still there. Daniel Eels was president of the Commercial Bank of Cleveland and was also director of 32 firms and held interests in oil, iron, steel, cement, coke, gas, and railroads. Here's another bygone favorite, although also not one of the homes to which a carriage house was associated. This was taken around 1915 and shows the loftus Cuddy House. 30 rooms, a stately portico supported by a pair of iconic columns at each corner. It should be ionic, I think. And extensive Palladian windows. Cuddy was president of the Cuddy Mullen Coal Company. This house became one of the Ursuline College classroom buildings. For those of you who aren't aware, Ursuline College was originally downtown, first near Public Square, then out around 55th Street, then out to the area just off of Cedar Road at Overlook, and then finally out to Pepper Pike in the mid-1950s. The Herrick estate would have been roughly pretty much directly across the street, with the entrance to the Mews at the lower right of this picture. Okay, here's one shot each of the 2 districts that I said I wasn't going to show you. First, the Fairhill Belgian Village development. Unfortunately, I don't have any old photos of the development, although I'm sure that they do exist. If anybody is aware of any, we would love to talk to you. Some of the homes are actually in Cleveland, incidentally, not Cleveland Heights. And then here's one photo from Shaker Lakes, which is also part of the city of Cleveland, but actually abuts both Cleveland Heights and Shaker Heights. It is leased to Shaker Heights by the city of Cleveland for $1 for 100 years. That breaks down to, thank you. I was stumbling. This shows the boathouse, which stood for years on the Shaker side near the parking lot where West Park and Larchmere come together. Now we move to our last 2 districts, one of which was added in 2009 and one that received confirmation from the state barely a month ago. As a few of you may know, the Inglewood and Oak Ridge area, just east of what was until recently the JCC, was developed by the Van Swearingen brothers in the 1920s. The first homes in the district were constructed on Inglewood around 1923. What you see inside the circle is what is the group of homes that just received National Register accreditation and are almost exclusively on Inglewood and Oak Ridge roads. Here are several of our favorite shots of the neighborhood. The home on the upper right on Inglewood was once home to Dr. Benjamin Spock. And I wonder how the kids in that house are faring. Actually, I know how they're faring because that's the home of Maisie and Mike Adams. And Maisie is a Historical Society trustee, and she and, I assume, her kids are about as normal as I could ever hope to be. On the lower right is the back porch of a home on Oak Ridge, which was taken in the early 1940s. Lastly, we have Forest Hill, not the park, and not the district next to the park, and certainly not the building. Forest Hill is a giant residential neighborhood bordered roughly on the east by Lee Road, on the north by Euclid Heights Boulevard, on the west by Coventry, and on the south by Washington Boulevard. Spearheaded by CSU Professor Mark Souther, it was submitted as a National Register nominee in December and placed on the National Register this spring, roughly a month ago. The house you see was built in 1909. It's on Redwood Road, and it was built, owned, and occupied by Grant Deming, who was the district's developer and brother of Barton Deming, who developed Euclid Golf. This is the oldest house in the Euclid development, in the Forest Hill development, which incidentally consists of roughly 650 houses. Washington Boulevard was positioned as Forest Hill's Grand Boulevard, with a generous 86-foot wide right-of-way with twin roadways divided by a grass median to accommodate a single-track electric streetcar that was known as a dinky, that to my knowledge ran all the way to Lee Road. This photo was taken in the mid-1920s from the roof of the Heights Art Theater. Yes, it is. The intersection is the western terminus of the Forest Hill neighborhood. And many of us remember that the aforementioned Washington Boulevard used to run all the way through to Coventry, as you can see in the upper center of the photo. To the left, of course, is the real Coventry School, which was torn down in the 1970s. Also, if you look closely just to the right of the school, you can see a wooden Quonset building that was used as a classroom. Our suburb was growing so fast that around that time these structures were not at all uncommon. Up the street on Euclid Heights Boulevard was Forest Hill's grand entrance, the three-way intersection of Euclid Heights Boulevard, Woodward Avenue, and Lincoln Boulevard. I don't know when the pillars came down, but it's really too bad that they did. That intersection, as we know, has been changed somewhat by creating a little center area that keeps Lincoln from dumping directly into Euclid Heights Boulevard. With so many homes, it isn't hard to see that the Forest Hill neighborhood's architecture is wildly eclectic. Here are some of the most attractive and diverse homes. On the lower right is one of my favorites, which was taken in the winter of 1968. The reason, I suppose, is it's the house that I grew up in. It's at the corner of East Overlook and Woodward. In his National Register application, Mark Souther describes the house as a craftsman-style structure with Swiss chalet adornments. It was designed by architect George H. Burroughs shortly after his graduation from the University of Michigan in 1920. The kid in the foreground is me. I was designed by my parents. And just when you think that there are no more Cleveland Heights neighborhoods to fit in the National Register, there are. Cleveland Heights resident Mary Dunbar, who is here this evening, and we're grateful for that, is spearheading an effort to place the district east of Coventry and north of Fairmount, including Arlington, Monmouth, Marlborough, and Fairfax, on the National Register. To my knowledge, the effort is proceeding well, although I don't know when precisely it will be submitted. Soon?
It's a long
Soon, go with soon. Anyone who knows the Heights area knows that this beautiful district is certainly worthy architecturally. This postcard is smack in the middle of the district, roughly 100 yards north of Fairmount on Fairfax, is it road or boulevard? Fairfax Road? The home on the right, the one with the wall, is gone, as is the wall itself. However, the pillars remain, and if you visit the neighborhood, you can see where the pillars join the wall on both sides. Because of the trees, it's hard to tell if the area at the point in the background has a home on it. Currently, there are several modern houses, more modern houses on the property, which replaced a grand mansion that was torn down, I believe, in the 1950s.
What are the east and west boundaries of that proposed district?
They run at all kinds of crazy angles, so it's a little bit hard to say. The south boundary, Mary, would be Fairmount. Oh, go for it.
It includes, so basically what we're doing is the Shaker land north of Willowbrook. So it also includes Dartmouth, Exeter, and Ashland, and East Monmouth, that far, the Plymouth, Fairmont, those areas. And we're still working on a few more pieces of it, but it also goes down North Park to Roxboro School, houses along North Park. Did the Shaker land used to go up to Scarborough? Pardon? Did the Shaker land, when you were at the Historical Society at Shaker, somebody told us that it might have gone up to Scarborough by Coventry.
Well, it's complicated. But yeah, basically,
Does it include Colchester Road?
your house, your.
Thank you.
Your neighbor, but not across the street.
That's weird.
Sarah?
No, she skipped out,
Yeah, she's.
but she may be back shortly. That may be her right now.
No, it takes a little explaining.
Well, actually, that is her. She just walked in. If there's something you want to ask her.
It's basically the house that was developed by the Shaker land, near the Shaker Heights, the Cougar companies, where and most of that was developed before Shaker Heights. They sort of got the model of Shaker Heights from the development of this area. Because it was developed about 10 years before. So we looked at Shaker, that's in the Shaker Village Historic District, it was developed in the 20s. And most of this area was developed in the 80s.
Thank you. It is complicated. Lastly, I should also mention the one glaring omission in the membership of the National Register districts in Cleveland Heights is the Euclid Heights development specifically, which was Patrick Calhoun's original development at the top of Cedar Hill, comprising Overlook Road, Berkshire, Kenilworth, and all of the areas that are bounded loosely by Euclid Heights Boulevard and then curving up to Overlook and Edge Hill. So as I mentioned, anybody who has a couple of thousand hours to spare, we would be more than happy to hear from you and work with you to see that this glaring omission is rectified sometime in the near future. So that is it for our tour. On behalf of Patrick Calhoun and John D. Rockefeller and the Cleveland Heights Historical Society and the Landmark Commission of Cleveland Heights, I'd like to thank you for attending here today, and I'd be pleased, or the more qualified members of our audience, I hope, would be pleased to answer any questions. Thank you. Are there any questions, comments, corrections? There must be corrections. Yes, ma'am. Silly me. It is, and there is a National Register designation effort currently in progress for Mayfield Heights. I neglected to mention that. It's being spearheaded by another Historical Society trustee, Chuck Owen, who lives on Somerton. And how exactly that effort is proceeding, I honestly don't know, other than to say that Chuck has done a lot of research, but whether or not it's been turned into something that is materially useful, I don't know. But the effort is definitely underway. Kara? Where does Coventry fit into these?
Well, Coventry is kind of half in Euclid Heights and half in Mayfield Heights. My sense probably would be that that would be eligible as its own separate district, just because the initial people who wanted to develop Mayfield Heights didn't foresee a commercial district, neither did the Euclid Heights, did Patrick Calhoun. So it could be its own separate nomination. The reality is, we just need people who have the time and wherewithal and energy to do these nominations. Because as anyone who's working on them can attest to, it's a big time commitment.
And there is anyone here, as we discussed a few moments ago. Not looking the worse for wear.
Chris, you
Yes, ma'am.
mentioned the Euclid Heights allotment, which Cara has written about, but you never mentioned Derbyshire. Is that part of that? Where your folks lived?
Lower Derbyshire would be part of Euclid, the Euclid Heights development. Derbyshire, essentially east of Euclid Heights, is part of Euclid Golf.
East of? Huh?
No. Well, Forest Hill, east of Coventry, west of Coventry, it would fit into the tip of Euclid Golf, because that's where Euclid Golf Club was, right?
Euclid Heights, though. Euclid Golf Club was not in Euclid Heights. Euclid Golf. North of Cedar is Euclid Heights, south of Cedar is Euclid Golf.
You had to come back just now and humiliate me, didn't you? So I guess the answer is, yeah, in a bunch
We
of
want to
different
be
districts.
included.
We can get you to work on it.
Ah, volunteer. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. They say the third time's the charm. I know twice before people have tried to resurrect, to rehab Severance Stables. And currently there's some people interested in doing that. But my question is a building in that poor condition eligible for this? You talked about primarily residential areas of the city, but is an individual building like that is in bad condition eligible for something like this? Do you know?
My knowledge would be yes.
Were you, I didn't hear the building you were referring to.
The Severance Stables.
I mean, I think from a historical standpoint, it's likely eligible. I haven't been inside in probably 10 years, and I guess it's a question of how much of the building remains intact versus, it's a function of how much, you're looking at, from an architectural standpoint, if you're looking to list it architecturally, it's a function of how much of the architecture is still there. And then if you're looking for a historical standpoint, it still has that historical association with the Severance. So it's just a way of evaluating it, but I think it's possible that it could be eligible for listing.
One of the hurdles would certainly be that it would have to be acceptable to the owners of the stables, which, as we know, is the Cleveland Heights School Board. And that may be a little bit tricky because of the perceived inflexibility that comes with National Register status. And the school board, I kind of get the impression, doesn't really know what it wants to do with it. At least that's been the case for about the last 4 decades. Anyone else? Yes, ma'am.
In the discussion of what's historic district and what's not historic district,
Do you guys have a map that, where the shaded areas are already on the register and these areas are not on the register?
No, but that would be a good idea.
The city has this map, they give them out. And I have one because I have boarders in my house that come from very far away. So I always make sure that in the guest room, there's that map of Cleveland Heights so people know where they're going, Walk here if you want coffee, here if you want groceries, et cetera.
Here if you want to be a historic building.
Here if you want to know where the historic districts are. The other thing I wanted to say is with regard to the ravine that in the Forest Hill Parkway now, that might be 9 Mile Creek, but I don't think it's Dugway. But you can find out because on Green City Blue Lake, David Beach walked from the beginning of Doug. He's got the whole thing written in an article. He walked it.
Huh.
So, and I'm pretty sure it goes down through Lakeview.
Steve, do you know which stream system? No, well, Forest Hill Parkway. That had to have been carved out by a waterway 1,000 years ago.
Yeah, the old maps on my website would probably show the original streets, but I don't remember.
The address of which is? Thank
Rails,
you.
Rails and Trails. Railsandtrails.com is where you can
railsandtrails.com.
find the old
It's
waterways
amazing.
before they were subverted.
That would show very early streams and everything, and they're already georeferenced, although not 100% accurately in Google Earth, so you can actually pay attention.
Great.
And then there's more current maps there too.
And I just wanted to answer as far as the maps on the National Register. I do have some ad hoc ones that I've created on my desk, and as we list more and more districts, I'm adding more and more onto our mapping system. So maybe in a few months, I can make something like that available on our website. That wouldn't be a difficult thing to do.
One of the cool things about these presentations is that the audience is always more capable of answering the questions than the speaker. Takes the pressure off. Yes, John?
I was surprised when you talked about Overlook. So there were these huge mansions that were torn down relatively early, because a lot of the mansions from the early 1900s that were torn down, most of them fell into bad repair by the 50s and then were torn down. But it sounds like the ones on Overlook, those like 3 of them were replaced relatively early.
Well, I don't know exactly when the houses that basically abutted Cedar Hill went out, although I would imagine it was probably in the 40s or very early 50s. The earliest one to get torn out, to my knowledge, was the Howell Hines house, because the Church of the Christ Scientist was built in the 1920s, I believe, incidentally by the exact same firm that designed Severance Hall. And if you stare at both structures, the resemblance is amazing.
And the Herrick house, though, was...
The Herrick house went out in the 40s.
Oh, okay. I thought it was-
And I'm guessing that the land laid fallow because I don't think Overlook House was built until probably the 60s. So that 20-year gap, I really do not know. There's a microphone behind you.
Some of the houses that have not fallen into disrepair, but the owners have died and all of their descendants are no longer interested in the houses, and they have designated that they be torn down. There was one on Fairmont Boulevard that was that way.
Yeah, the Herrick, isn't it the Herrick Mansion? Clark, Harold T. Clark. That was specifically what happened with the Clark Mansion, which stood roughly at Marlboro?
It's between Marlboro and
Yes. It's one of the most obnoxiously egocentric things I can think of, is to have your house torn down. The founder of the Medusa Cement Company lived on North Park, just east of its intersection with North Woodland. And there's now a beautiful new house on that property, as well as a carriage house. And he also stipulated that upon his death, that house was to be torn down. I've never seen a picture of it, but it's about 50 to 100 yards east of the point where Woodland and North Park come together, kind of catty corner from Shaker Lake. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
There's another Medusa cement house,
There could well be, but I'm not aware of it.
yeah, we saw it for sale a few years ago when we were in the home here, and it was just amazing, the staircase going up. The rest of the top, second, third floor are really, really bad shape.
And where is it?
on Kenilworth, right, or somehow bordering it, Kenilworth.
On the north side of that work that curves around there,
Yeah.
near that eccentric house with the iron gate around it.
Oh, yeah, that just had about $20,000 worth of prop-up-the-land work done on it.
This is a, yeah, it has a concrete staircase.
Right, yeah, exactly, it's just amazing, yeah.
Huh.
And the other question is, what is the best way to go about, I've heard just going into the county deeds office or something to track the history of your house, the ownership of there? Is there a standard way to just go about doing that?
Kara, on your mark, get set, go.
This has got to be like.
I knew this was going to be it's not 25 words or less. But I'll put my business cards at the back, but if you call City Hall and just at 291-4444 and ask for me, Kara, or say you're researching your house, they'll forward you to me. I have a database that has any original permit information. I have some original permits, but they're not blueprints. It's some basic information about your house. Also, if you go to clevelandheights.com and on the left-hand side it says History and Architecture, if you click on that, there's a little worksheet. It says Your Old House. It's a little worksheet on how to do the research on your house. But the best place to start is with me because I can get you some basic information, and you can go to the archives. My direct line at City Hall is 291-4885. But if you just call and say you're looking for research. And if you go to that website, my email address is there too. And it usually takes me a couple weeks to get that information.
So 25 words or less is 1-800-Kara-Hamley-O'Donnell.
I
Yes,
wonder, Chris, if you or maybe someone else in the room knows where the architect Philip Johnston grew
Yes.
up in
Yes.
Cleveland Heights. What house?
Philip Johnson lived in a house that is no longer standing, that is just to the south of the Alfred Hoyt Granger house. Kara, correct me if I'm wrong, on Overlook Road, basically between the large apartment building, or between Overlook House and the Alfred Hoyt Granger house. There is a slightly newer French Norman house that's really very attractive, but not original to the development that was built, I believe, on the site of Philip Johnson's
It's
house.
not my area of expertise, and I know that Chris mentioned before that Marion Morton has a brand new book out. I think the title is The Overlook. But it's, everything you wanted to know about The Overlook and very interesting. And I'm not sure if it's in bookstores, but it should be. If it's not, I'd check at Apple Tree or Max Specs and see when it's going to be in.
Yes, Leda.
Not a question, but a comment.
Thank God.
Whenever I see things like this, I'm amazed, and I don't have my dates right, but all of this would have been gone had they put the highway up Lee Road. What was it, in the 60s, right?
1965, 66.
And how residents, community residents, stopped it from happening. But all those would not exist. My house wouldn't exist. Lee Road would be a highway.
Lee Road would be more than a highway, it would have been an interchange. Right, the two interchanges on the Clark and Lee freeways would have been Cedar and Lee and South Park and Lee. If you can imagine South Park and Lee basically being a clutter of Shoney's and McDonald's. It almost happened, and incidentally, on the Cleveland Heights Historical Society's website in the stories section, there is a complete article on the Clark and Lee freeways and how it was stopped by citizen action.
Can I just add to that it has not stopped? It stopped in Cleveland Heights because of some well-heeled ladies in tennis shoes who were connected to financiers and economists and elected officials and bankers and rich people. They were the Garden Club. The Lee Clark Freeway began in 1957, and it continues today. It's now closer to what was at that time called the Central Freeway. Now we call it the Opportunity Corridor. And the Opportunity Corridor is going to run through poor people's backyards, and it will relocate or dislocate them so that wealthy people can get to University Circle from the west side. So just as you see the propaganda about the Opportunity Corridor, you should know that though some well-heeled folks that were well-connected to the legislature were able to override the Lee Clark Freeway and create the Shaker Lakes Nature Center, ODOT is still at it, and you can read in the meeting memos the John Model, who's with Ohio Department of Transportation District 12, talk about the fact that they have been trying to make this road happen despite those disgruntled old ladies in Cleveland Heights and Shaker Heights since 1957. So I just ask you to think about how NIMBY figures into this when we start talking about how nice it will be to run a $375 million 2.75 mile road from 490, the terminus of 490, because 490 was originally supposed to go through the Shaker Lakes all the way to 271.
Oh, yeah, that's the other aspect of the Clark and Lee freeways. And the arrogance is very reminiscent of County Engineer Albert Porter in the 1960s, who responded to a letter from a 12-year-old girl pleading to not have her neighborhood destroyed, where he referred to her as a snotty little kid who should mind her own business. He died in jail.
Yeah, but now Terry Hamilton Brown is telling the poor people in the Opportunity Corridor area that they don't need to worry about it. In the meantime, they've been dealing with this issue for 20 years, and they don't, more recently, as it comes up, it comes up in waves. I listen to people say, well, should I replace the roof on my house that I own outright or not? So it's that kind of stress that we are pushing down the hill, because those people are not us and it's not our problem.
I went to a meeting down at CSU about this maybe 6 or so months ago, and I asked, why can't you just use East 55th Street? You know, it's already there, coming off the freeway.
Yeah, I mean, there isn't any really good reason that I can see. If you have 55th Street, it's not that heavily trafficked a street, that you can get up to where you need to go. But they won't tell you where the end of the Opportunity Corridor is either. You know, it's just going to dump a bunch of traffic up around University Circle somewhere.
Imagine 490 where it runs into 55th Street, cutting at an angle and emerging in University Circle roughly behind the bus station.
Actually, no, it's going to go up East 105. Quincy and 105, it will turn north and cut up 105, which is
Oh, I see.
why
Okay.
when the temple made that deal with Case Western Reserve University becoming a new performing arts space, I was a bit relieved, because the original plan was for 490 to continue to University Circle and then cut north along East 105 all the way to 90. That was the original.
That would have blasted it through Rockefeller Park.
Yes. Wow. But, you know.
Ew.
So we just have to be really careful with those highways.
Oh, yeah, that's, and anyone who has not visited Tremont knows very well what a freeway can do to a neighborhood. To this day, and Tremont has done a wonderful job of recovering. However, there is a good side and a bad side of Tremont, and the dividing line is the freeway.
Also, it's very harmful to Cleveland Heights, because then people can live in their dime and get up to the clinic quicker than they could now, than they can now. So it allows people to live further away from the hospital.
So that's a good point. It's the escapist mentality that a lot of the freeway systems were based on, is how to get out of here faster. Mm-hmm. Yep. Every time you build a new freeway, it's basically not to get people in, it's to get people out. Anyone else? Okay, once again, we thank you all for coming. And have a wonderful evening and enjoy what remains of this beautiful day.